From the 15th of October, 1942, Infantry Regiment 7 was a grenadier regiment, a unit in the Prussian tradition. It served in the First World War as Grenadier Regiment König Friedrich Wilhelm II, 1, Schlesisches, Nr. 10. After reorganization and reformation, it had participated from 1935 to 1939 as Infantry Regiment 7 in the campaign in Poland. In 1939 and 1940, it fought in the campaign in the West. Within the unit of the 28th Infantry Division, to which it had belonged since the beginning of the war, it was prepared for the attack on the Soviet Union in the Suwalki sector in East Prussia. It was in the Gschatsk-Stellung, some 150 km west-southwest of Moscow, that I joined the regiment. On the 2nd of July in St. Avold, I had begun my journey which, as a straggler following my comrades, I had to make on my own. The journey passed through Berlin and Warsaw. At first, I was in trains carrying men back to the front from leave, but from Warsaw to Smolensk, through West Prussia, Kovno, Vilna, Dunaburg, Polotsk, Vitebsk, I was in an empty hospital train. On the 4th of July, I sent to my mother and sisters every best wishes from the German-Russian frontier. From Vyazma, I wrote on the 8th of July that I was very impressed by the Russian landscape and by what I had seen on the journey, and that I was hoping to arrive at my unit the day after tomorrow. At last, on the 10th of July, I wrote my first letter as a sender, with field post number 17638C, from the 6th Company of Infantry, Regiment 7. From Gschatsk onwards, to which goods trains were travelling, I had to march with my knapsack. At the regimental command post, the commander even shook my hand to welcome me. Then there was a further march via the battalion command post to the company, which was commanded by Oberleutnant Bayer. I was immediately assigned my post as MG Schütze, Machine Gunner 1. The company had just been resting for some days in the woods close to the regimental command post and the bag gauge train village of Schabino. We were to go back up the line the following night and relieve another company. As the 7th Company was being relieved, I met Jochen Fiedler and his section leader Kreckler, our block seniors from St. Avold. Fiedler said that of the 11 of us, only 6 were with Infantry Regiment 7. The others had joined Infantry Regiment 232 or 235. The relief had proceeded smoothly, so that the sections, at intervals of several minutes, and of course in single file, marched away, to avoid making any noise and alerting the enemy. In the trenches during the day it was more or less quiet. The Russians fired off some shells only now and then, and those were only of light caliber. By contrast, during the night the Russians did not trust the calm. So the nights were dominated by a perpetual blind cacophony of explosions. At midnight, when the summer night was at its darkest, for the first time I went alone on sentry duty. Somewhere else and under other circumstances, I might have thought of Leno's Night, whose dark eye was resting on me, solemn, gentle, dreamy, and unfathomably sweet, translator's note, Nicolas Leno, German lyric poet, 1802–50. But then I had a redoubled sense of loneliness. I did not know my way about the positions, which were strange to me, and I had not yet seen them in daylight. I did not know where the enemy was, and could only guess where my fellow sentries were. I only knew the way from the sentry post to the bunker. For a short time I was overcome by a feeling of being deserted. It seemed to bode ill for my probation at the front that the company Zarge, immediately after I arrived in the baggage train village, had ordered that I get my hair cut. Then, at the field church service in the full glare of the sun, when I was wearing my Stahlhelm, I had felt ill. I felt completely alone. I had no view in the direction of the enemy, since our trenches were behind an incline. The only thing that happened during those first 2 hours on sentry duty was the tour of inspection by the company commander. I scarcely heard his approach. Eyes directed forward, I quietly made the regulation report, nothing unusual to report. It was only on the 14th of July that I had to transfer into the 1st platoon of the company, to take over the section of a NCO who was going on leave. A week or so later, we officer cadets were assembled in Schabino, near to the regimental command post. We had to take yet one more revision course before our promotion to NCO. That was expected on the 1st of August. The course was given by Oberleutnant Steif, the then regimental adjutant. I met him again in 1975 in Vienna, where, as a brigade general in the German Bundeswehr, He was taking part in the negotiations which dragged on for years concerning bilateral reduction of forces in Europe. After an unquiet night, on the 15th of August, at 6:15 a.m. the Soviets again attacked with armour and infantry. With the energetic support of the artillery, it was possible to repulse all enemy attacks. But to the west of the position, the Soviets had succeeded in pushing forward through a gap towards Besmino. By striking out widely, they encircled Infanterie Regiment 7. With Kampfgruppe Karst taking up a position of all-round defence, it was possible to block the highway successfully further on. On the 17th of August, heavy fighting was taking place around the village of Silenki, while the 292nd Infantry Division withdrew to a line further to the north. Siri, Owsley combat-weary, completely soaked, with only cold rations, the troops were partly broken through in a very strong armoured attack. They had to make a fighting withdrawal onto the Upolossi high ground. As a result, Upolossi itself was drawn in to the bridgehead position. West of Upolossi, the enemy had broken through at Popauka. That was Infantry Regiment 19. One company of Panzerabteilung 18 was placed under the command of Kampfgruppe Karst, and Supp ported the infantry. A Stuka attack in the early morning of 18th August on Cholmino and the wooded territory to the southeast of Upolossi won some more breathing space. Enemy armour, assembled immediately south of Cholmino, was shattered by artillery fire. The gap to the west of Kampfgruppe Karst still yawned. On the east Ernwing Feldersatzbataillon 292, then under the command of the Kampfgruppe, maintained the connection. Renewed enemy attempts to assemble armour were successfully opposed by the artillery. But it was not possible to prevent Soviet infantry, with armour, from advancing to the west of Upolossi northwards across the Vorsha. The enemy seemed from this point to have shifted the emphasis of their attack from the east against 292nd Infanterie Division. They moved opposite the sector held by Kampfgruppe Karst and further westwards. The intervention of Infanterie Regiment 82 on 20th August and the arrival of Infanterie Regiment 282 had a relieving effect on the Kampfgruppe. On thus 24th August it was possible to repulse a large-scale enemy attack on the Upolossi sector. But further to the west, the enemy succeeded in taking Bekrino and Shatesha. On 1st September, Oberst Karst was decorated with the Knight's Cross for personal gallantry in counterattacking. On 2nd September, fresh enemy attacks took place against the Upolossi bridgehead, but they were all repulsed. Only on 6th September were orders executed for the planned evacuation of that position. Bataillon Wielhauer returned to the division with a combat strength of about 80 men. A small barracks at Waldlager Nord was sufficient to provide accommodation for that little band. My personal experience was more exciting than the picture painted by the dry report from the regimental history. During the night, the battalion was relieved from its position and removed from the division's field reserve. I handed over my section sector and the stocks of ammunition, hand grenades and machine gun belts. We thought it was a relief that those supplies did not need to be dragged along. I marched off with the section in the direction of the assembly area to which we had been ordered. Company after company joined us on the route. Soon the whole battalion was on the march with us. We went in line, one behind the other, at long intervals, in order to invite as few casualties as possible in the event that we were attacked from the air or fired on. From Shabino, the baggage train village, the battalion went to Geshatsk, to the camp in the woods some kilometres north of the town. In the summer of 1941, that camp had served as headquarters to the Russian Supreme Commander, Central Sector, Marshal Timoshenko. Hauptfeldwebel Melin, the Sage, a strict, self-possessed man, had his cross with the drivers, not only those of the horse-drawn vehicles. In a mighty voice he gave out his orders. In pure Silesian, one of them asked, "What have a fått tek, Herr Hauptfeld?" And the Hauptfeldwebel replied, "Tek de Poishu," by which he meant a captured French Peugeot lorry. Several ways led to Gzhatsk. The one that went via Staroye was the furthest, but was better for the vehicles and the Peugeot. We followed the route that had more corduroy roads and was therefore better. But even so, to the accompaniment of dreadful cursing, horses and motor vehicles had to be heaved out of the sticky mud. On the way, it was passed from man to man that we had set off as Army Reserve and should be getting some rest. I believed it. The old hands did not. On 23rd of August 1942, in the brightness of the dawn morning, we arrived in the camp in the woods and settled ourselves down in the barracks. I slept for some hours. 2 wards. Noon. There was something to eat, and afterwards there was a frontline film show. While the film Der große Schatten, The Great Shadow, was still running, the battalion adjutant shouted, "Alert!" Barely 5 minutes later, the battalion was standing ready to march. When the lorries of an army mobile column arrived, we were immediately loaded up. We were told that the Russians had broken through at Juchnau and that we were to be thrown into the gap created by that move. The journey through the bare countryside, only here and there crossed by bushes and woods, was not exactly pleasant. We travelled standing, squatting, or sitting on machine gun boxes. The oldies who had taken part in the advance and the winter retreat said that it was no picnic which awaited us. We younger ones, dropped in the shit, again, did indeed feel the tension hanging over everyone. It could be read in the expressions of the officers, but it was more with curiosity and interest than with fear that we looked forward to the things that this fire brigade action would bring. Outside the village of Sawinki, some 30 kilometres northwest of Medin, we were unloaded. Immediately, a security line was formed in platoon strength in the direction of the enemy. I lay with my section beside the road that led to the enemy. Somewhere in front there were still supposed to be German troops. No. One knew any more. A motorcycle with sidecar drove up from behind us. A strange officer got out. To my report, he said, sounding surprised, "Infanterie Regiment 7. My God, that's an active regiment." To my ears it sounded as if he had determined that from then nothing else could happen, and that it was a dead certainty that the Russian breakthrough would be cleaned up. Just as we had hastily dug in, I was taken by a runner to the battalion commander. He ordered me, and the section, to carry out a reconnaissance patrol into the woods that lay about 2 kilometres in front of us. The object was to find out if they were occupied by the enemy. It was my first reconnaissance patrol. It was the real thing, the active beginning of my probation at the front. On the successful completion of this depended my whole life's ambition. I instructed the men, and we set off. The first signs of dusk were just becoming noticeable when we reached the woodland. We went in line, spaced widely apart, but could see no trace of the enemy. We crossed a tongue of woodland, while I, as I had learned during training, tracked our direction of march with a compass. Finally, we marched in a long curve leftwards as far as the road and turned back. Halfway the battalion met us. In the meantime, they had been ordered to take up positions in front of the wood facing the enemy. The tongue of woodland we had just crossed was the edge of a larger forest that stretched over to the right. It offered the Russians a good opportunity to take us unopposed in the rear. An attempt was then made to counter the danger by having the 7th Company take up position almost at right angles to the forward deployed 5th and 6th Companies. We would provide cover for the battalion from the direction of the wood. To my disappointment, my section was held in reserve. We had to dig in again, but on fairly open ground. By that time, night had fallen, and it seemed to me that we would not be staying in that position for very long. I had the men dig only moderately deep foxholes, just deep enough to be able to snatch some hours' sleep in them with adequate protection against shell splinters. The foxhole I had myself dug barely reached to my knees, so that my body, lying on bushes as a kind of bedding and covered in the same way, did not protrude above the level of the ground. Within moments there crept over me the uncomfortable thought that I was lying in a coffin. Night passed and gave way to morning. The enemy, it was said, were preparing to attack. From my coffin, I watched uneasily as, to the right of the sector of the 7th Company, 300 mm to 400 mil away, individual brown figures, at intervals of a minute or so, were jumping across a small clearing between covering undergrowth. To judge from the direction in which they were moving, they were evidently trying to get into the tongue of woodland lying to the battalion's rear. The Russians were demonstrating their well-tried tactic of trickling through. You could work out how long it would take a company or still larger units to have Gath aired in the wood behind us. Those movements had been reported to the battalion. Then the orders I had expected reached me. With my section, I had to take up position at the extreme wing of the 7th Company, facing west in thick woodland. There was virtually no field of fire. In places it was only 5 to 10 metres. On the left, I was beside the section led by Krekler, our old block senior. On the right, there were no neighbours at all. When Krekler and I saw each other, neither of us thought of our time together being polished up into soldiers. It is true, it was a time that had not been as much an effort for him as it had for me. We just shook hands and said, as if with one voice, "Eh, lad, what a bloody mess." Once again, it was the old story of digging holes. After we had finished, it began to rain. Thin, continuous streams of rain trickled down from the sky. Sooner or later, it would have soaked us to the skin. Of the enemy, there was nothing more to be heard. We could only suspect that they must be somewhere in front of us in the wood, in considerable numbers. Wrapped in branches and tarpaulins, we tried to protect ourselves from the penetrating rain that fell even more heavily. Soon water began to gather in the foxholes. Hours passed. Still there was no end to the rain. The sound of the rain and the wind and the darkness of night as it began to fall could almost make us forget that we were on the front line and had to watch out for an enemy. After I had assigned the watch, I tried, as I sat on the hollow side of my Stahlhelm in the puddles in my foxhole, to find some degree of comfort. I was shaken out of my chilly doze when the order came to take 2 men on a reconnaissance patrol in the wood. I had to find where the Russians were. It seemed pointless to me. The rain was getting even heavier. There was complete darkness. It was already midnight. I considered the task to be well nigh impossible. I would either find out nothing at all, or possibly run right through the foxholes that the Russians had dug for themselves. I could lose my way, despite the compass, or even fall into a Russian foxhole unawares. In any of those cases, the reconnaissance I was ordered to carry out would show no satisfactory result. I chose 2 volunteers, and we set off. It was so dark that from time to time each of us had to keep hold of the other so as not to get separated. Again and again we would stop and crouch down to listen. The darkness of the wood and the crackling rain did not allow us to hear or to see anything. With my machine pistol cocked, I felt my way and crept forwards, my finger on the trigger, always expecting to be fired on suddenly out of the darkness or to bump into a Russian or at least a tree. Then, in a clearing, the existence of which was more to be sensed than seen, there was a sound that did not fit in with the symphony of the storm. We dropped straight to the ground and saw a section of Russians, 6 or 8 men, cross the clearing. I saw their silhouettes, the contours of the plain, old-style Russian helmets outlined against the sky. They came quite close to us, went past, and were swallowed up in the darkness. My 2 men, experienced Obergefreiters, did not think of giving themselves away. As for me, however, my heart stood still. I held my breath and pressed the trigger. The bolt of the machine pistol shot forward with a crack, but no shot was fired. There was a blockage. Despite that mishap, nothing happened. In the wind and rain, the Russians had heard nothing. We turned round and, with the help of the compass, searching and feeling our way, we reached our positions. I reported our observations. At about 1:30 a.m. on 15th August 1942, the kitchen arrived after almost 2 days. It brought cold bean soup that had gone sour. Even so, it was gulped down ravenously. In the foxhole, under the dripping tarpaulin, I dismantled the machine pistol by the light of a tallow candle and cleaned it with clammy, wet fingers. Sand and water had caused the blockage during the reconnaissance patrol. In the open country it should have become light soon after midnight, but in the wood nothing could be seen of the dawning day. Only towards 3 a.m. did the coming day show itself. At the same time men's voices could be heard from the direction of the enemy. They indicated that the enemy were pushing forward. By means of loud shouts, the Russians ensured that they kept together. They came nearer and nearer. We had to let them approach to within 10 meters of us because we could not see them sooner. Once again, I went from foxhole to foxhole and gave instructions, especially to the leading machine gunner. Both he and I were facing our first real battle. The young Pomeranian had arrived a few days before with the replacements. It was the first time since the beginning of the Russian campaign that, for the Silesian regiment, the replacements did not come from Silesia. The Russian voices became louder. There was the crack of branches. They must already have come to within 50 meters of us. Meanwhile, we stood in our foxholes and stared into the undergrowth out of which they had to appear. There they were, at last. The place was heaving with brown figures. The wood seemed to be spitting them out. To judge by the direction of their bodies and their eyes, they intended to push by obliquely on the right. We fired on them from the flank. The machine gunner was scattering the first bursts of fire from his weapon. In what direction was he firing? He didn't seem to be hitting anything, because I saw no Russians falling. But he had to be hitting them. They were no more than 10 paces away. This time my machine pistol did not miss fire, but I caught myself not aiming at all. I was simply pointing the gun and pulling the trigger, but I was firing too high. I pointed lower. Out of the cluster of brown figures into which the machine gun was spraying its bullets, a tall young Russian came forward and flung an egg hand grenade at the machine gunner. The latter was still trying to get out and change position with the machine gun while I gave him covering fire. Still, there was no end to the rain. The sound of the rain and the wind and the darkness of night as it began to fall could almost make us forget that we were on the front line and had to watch out for an enemy. After I had assigned the watch, I tried, as I sat on the hollow side of my Stahlhelm in the puddles in my foxhole, to find some degree of comfort. I was shaken out of my chilly doze when the order came to take 2 men on a reconnaissance patrol in the wood. I had to find where the Russians were. It seemed pointless to me. The rain was getting even heavier. There was complete darkness. It was already midnight. I considered the task to be well nigh impossible. I would either find out nothing at all, or possibly run right through the foxholes that the Russians had dug for themselves. I could lose my way, despite the compass, or even fall into a Russian foxhole unawares. In any of those cases, the reconnaissance I was ordered to carry out would show no satisfactory result. I chose 2 volunteers, and we set off. It was so dark that from time to time each of us had to keep hold of the other so as not to get separated. Again and again we would stop and crouch down to listen. The darkness of the wood and the crackling rain did not allow us to hear or to see anything. With my machine pistol cocked, I felt my way and crept forwards, my finger on the trigger, always expecting to be fired on suddenly out of the darkness, or to bump into a Russian, or at least a tree. Then, in a clearing, the existence of which was more to be sensed than seen, there was a sound that did not fit in with the symphony of the storm. We dropped straight to the ground and saw a section of Russians, 6 or 8 men, cross the clearing. I saw their silhouettes, the contours of the plain, old-style Russian helmets outlined against the sky. They came quite close to us, went past, and were swallowed up in the darkness. My 2 men, experienced Obergefreiters, did not think of giving themselves away. As for me, however, my heart stood still. I held my breath and pressed the trigger. The bolt of the machine pistol shot forward with a crack, but no shot was fired. There was a blockage. Despite that mishap, nothing happened. In the wind and rain, the Russians had heard nothing. We turned round and, with the help of the compass, searching and feeling our way, we reached our positions. I reported our observations. At about 1:30 a.m. on 15th August 1942, the kitchen arrived after almost 2 days. It brought cold bean soup that had gone sour. Even so, it was gulped down ravenously. In the foxhole, under the dripping tarpaulin, I dismantled the machine pistol by the light of a tallow candle and cleaned it with clammy, wet fingers. Sand and water had caused the blockage during the reconnaissance patrol. In the open country, it should have become light soon after midnight, but in the wood nothing could be seen of the dawning day. Only towards 3 a.m. did the coming day show itself. At the same time, men's voices could be heard from the direction of the enemy. They indicated that the enemy were pushing forward. By means of loud shouts, the Russians ensured that they kept together. They came nearer and nearer. We had to let them approach to within 10 meters of us because we could not see them sooner. Once again, I went from foxhole to foxhole and gave instructions, especially to the leading machine gunner. Both he and I were facing our first real battle. The young Pomeranian had arrived a few days before with the replacements. It was the first time since the beginning of the Russian campaign that, for the Silesian regiment, the replacements did not come from Silesia. The Russian voices became louder. There was the crack of branches. They must already have come to within 50 meters of us. Meanwhile, we stood in our foxholes and stared into the undergrowth out of which they had to appear. There they were, at last. The place was heaving with brown figures. The wood seemed to be spitting them out. To judge by the direction of their bodies and their eyes, they intended to push by obliquely on the right. We fired on them from the flank. The machine gunner was scattering the first bursts of fire from his weapon. In what direction was he firing? He didn't seem to be hitting anything, because I saw no Russians falling. But he had to be hitting them. They were no more than 10 paces away. This time my machine pistol did not miss fire, but I caught myself not aiming at all. I was simply pointing the gun and pulling the trigger, but I was firing too high. I pointed lower. Out of the cluster of brown figures into which the machine gun was spraying its bullets, a tall young Russian came forward and flung an egg hand grenade at the machine gunner. The latter was still trying to get out and change position with the machine gun while I gave him covering fire. Then the grenade exploded and the poor young lad collapsed, half out of his cover, across his machine gun. The men from my section had withdrawn. I had lost contact with them. I was standing alone when a hand grenade rolled up at my feet. Darting from side to side, I jumped back. There was nothing else I could do. I had to leave the dead machine gunner and his weapon where they lay. Quite some time later, the section was ordered back by the battalion. I reported again to the company commander, who was glad that we had been able to withdraw. He was holding the section in reserve at the command post. We took up our coffin holes from the previous night and hurriedly made them deeper. Things did not remain quiet for long. The pressure on the 5th and 6th companies was even greater. One infantry attack had already been beaten off. During the next few hours it was announced that we were getting air support, and the order was given to lay out the aerial recognition cloths. Ground troops carried those cloths with them so as to identify themselves at any given time to their own air force. They were about 1 square metre in size, either orange-coloured cloths or swastika flags. They were to be spread out on the ground, on buildings, or on vehicles. The loud sound of engines announced the arrival of the aircraft. The approaching aeroplanes gave us cause for hope. Despite the extremely serious situation, a feeling of strength overcame me, because up to then we had seen nothing of the Russian Air Force. First, a flight of Stukas, Jew, Junkers, 87s, flew in. Almost vertically, they dived down with their engines screaming. The detonations of the bombs followed. Then a squadron of Jew 88s also attacked, and finally Heinkel 111 bombers. Unfortunately, ahead of the 5th Company sector, they had dropped their bombs too short. There were dead and wounded. Among them was the excellent company commander, Oberleutnant Esken. Not long after that short pause, there suddenly rang out shouts of, "Tanks! Tanks!" And for the first time in my life, I heard the characteristic dull rumble, that unforgettable grinding noise of heavy tank engines. A scout car was the first to drive from the left through our lines. Unconcerned, he rattled on up the Sawinki-Upolosi road. When he got as far as the Battalion command post, he was polished off with one shot from a 5mm anti-tank gun. From my inactivity in the reserve, I was able to watch from the command post how the gunners let him approach, and then, from 30m range, let him have it so that he lurched to a halt. With his hands in the air, a barefoot Russian, smeared with blood and oil, crept out. Our company commander told us a few days later that the prisoner said the Russians deployed entire families as tank crews. The husband was the driver, the wife aimed and fired the gun, and the adolescent son loaded the gun. You could well believe it. From the tongue of woodland where the 7th Company and my section had been, shortly after the scout car had been destroyed, a single Russian ran out with loud cries. He shouted in a hoarse voice, "Kamerad! Kamerad!" As if he himself wanted to desert to us, or wanted us to desert to his side, he held up one hand, gesticulating. But suddenly the older man pulled a hand grenade from his pocket, pulled out the pin, and held the grenade in the air. It exploded and mangled his hand. Thereupon he ran back into the woodland, wailing loudly. What he wanted remained a mystery to all of us. The Russians again mounted a frontal attack on the main fighting line with tanks and infantry. The tanks fired with their cannon and machine guns while we were under heavy mortar fire. In front they were shouting Urai and were already breaking through. A runner came under the heaviest covering fire and reported what we had realized without him telling us, that the main fighting line could not be held. Oberleutnant Bayer, the commander, without waiting for orders from the battalion, decided to withdraw some 100 meters. On his order, the entire company ran across the short stretch of level ground. When they had reached the level of the command post, he too ran back and I with him. The Oberleutnant, in a bleached summer tunic with a yellow-brown belt, knew that he presented a particularly good target to the enemy. He sprinted like a runner in a race and had overtaken the company in no time. Behind us, the tanks rattled up, firing with everything they had, while our men ran back in front of them. God Almighty, let it soon be evening, I thought. Unsure, under the stress of being in the thick of events, and under cover in the hollow, I could see nothing of the enemy. In the immediate main line of resistance, 50 meters further forward, I would have been able to survey the ground. I would have seen them attacking and breaking through. I would have been able myself to take aim and fire. But there at the company command post, I was condemned to wait under grueling fire, unable to do anything. Finally, the decisive attack was made. 3 tanks of the types KV-1 and KV-2, the latter 56 tons in weight and armed with a 15 centimeters howitzer, drove up the road and through the battalion's front. The anti-aircraft guns were gone, the anti-tank unit long since lost. From in front there rang out Uray. Then our men were ting out of their trenches and retreating. They could no longer be stopped. The tanks had also overrun the field dressing station, where a number of wounded were waiting to be transported away. The tanks then formed up some 200 meters behind the scattering remnants of the battalion. In a triangle on the elevated open ground, each one gave the other cover. Beside the knocked-out scout car I noticed as I passed the dead platoon commander of the 7th Company. A man took his paybook and broke off his identification tag. I could see no outward injury on the dead man. It must have been a tiny splinter in the head or in the heart that had brought his life to an end. While I was standing by the dead man, suddenly I could no longer see any of my own men. The air was ringing out again with Uray, the whistling and bursting of the shells and infantry guns. Even the company commander was no longer to be seen. So I hurried after some Lanzer who were striving to get across a small hollow to a wood, evidently with the intention of getting around the tanks. I caught up with them, and we hurried together along the edge of the woodland to get past the firing monsters. After we had successfully got round them, we reached a river that had overflowed its banks. From somewhere or other, bullets crackled in the water. I began to wade and sank deeper and deeper. With one hand, I held my machine pistol over my head. In the deepest places, I had to move as if swimming. Soon I felt the bottom under my feet. Again and again, probably from one of the tanks, a machine gun spat fire at us. The fellow must be able to see us. What should I do now? Inexperienced as I was, I thought myself to be the only survivor of the company. The men with me belonged to another unit. We decided to look for the baggage trains, which surely had to be in one of the neighbouring villages. Night had fallen by the time we found them. The Sarge welcomed me. There was not one word of reproach. He knew what had happened. I had to make my report. I did so and was secretly ashamed that I had run to the baggage village instead of looking for my comrades further forwards. The Sarge left me no time for that. He himself gave me fresh, dry clothes and ordered me to sleep in late. The next day at noon I was to go forwards again with the food vehicle. Then he took me into a floor-boarded room in a Russian house, in which 9 other scattered men were sleeping. I lay down with them, my haversack under my head, on the hard floor of the farm cottage. On the morning of the 16th of August, 1942, I awoke from a leaden sleep with the feeling that I had only just gone to sleep. Washing, shaving, the fresh clothes without lice. What a joy! Then I inspected the contents of my pockets. The letters were washed out, the photographs stuck together and useless. But worse still, my paybook was similarly illegible. Some of my papers, among them my driving license, were missing. I had just put them down in my gas mask case with my gas mask, and then forgotten them when the CO gave the order to withdraw. During the previous days I had not dared to think of the imminent end of my probation at the front, but the fact that the order to return to my regiment came on that very morning was a new piece of good fortune. Then I only needed to report in up front. With that relieving certainty within me, I joined the food vehicle. The Russians were taking a breather. The company was not even under fire. The command post was based in a house, not in a hole in the ground. The CO was pleased to see me when I reported, and immediately gave notice of departure. He looked weary and had long stubble. He had once again had uncanny luck, he said. When he was standing under cover behind a hayrick, a tank shell came through the several meters of hay, but was slowed down so much that only its head came out on the other side. There, it was finally brought to a halt by Bayer's belt buckle. It gave him quite a fright, but nothing happened. It did not explode. He wished me all the best for the journey home and sent his greetings to the regiment. Then I left. But however depressing the events of the last few days had been, and however much I was looking forward to getting to War College, it was not an easy thing for me to leave the company. It seemed to me undeserved that the Scheisse, I have to use the proper expression for the action, should be at an end, for me of all people. Among many others, even our old friend Crackler had been killed. The battalion of more than 500 men had shrunk to a fifth that size. The 6th then only numbered 26 men. With such thoughts in my mind, I got into the lorry travelling to the division. As we were driving out of the baggage village, rifle fire was cracking behind us into the morass of the road. The road was under enemy observation.